Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, I'm going to be trying to build on the success that my Excelsior video had by taking another deep dive into another movie era ship, this time the Refit Enterprise, the Constitution Refit. From the title, you will know what I'm going to be saying about this ship, and I will now give you a brief disclaimer. I like the Constitution Refit as a piece of production design. As an aesthetic, I love it. I love the motion picture era as a period in Star Trek history. I like it a lot. I think it's a very nice ship. But I can't help but see the flaws in it. And I like it more because of these flaws. Just because I point out flaws in ships, a lot of people seem to think that when I point out flaws in ships means I don't like it. That's not the case at all. I like ships with flaws. It's what makes them interesting. Also, before I begin, I'll give a shout out to a channel called Half Screen, who does various 3D model breakdowns and cutaways of different sci-fi ships, and he's been doing a series on the Constitution Refit, and it's quite good. A really detailed model. Very interesting indeed. And finally, the reason I'm going to be breaking this down is we don't see other vessels undergo a Constitution-style refit ever again, and I think there is good reason for that, other than ships didn't go from small screen to big screen in the way that they did for the first time with Star Trek the Motion Picture, which of course has recently had its anniversary. Probably not by the time this goes out. Who knows? It's probably over by the time this goes out, but you probably watched it. I'll have to sit myself down and watch the slow motion picture, because I haven't yet. Anyway, with that all out of the way and all my sins freely bared before all of you, we'll get into the video and as to why the Constitution Refit is basically how you ruin a perfectly good design. So, one of the fundamental ideas of the Constitution program was that it was always designed to be refitted, that they were going to go out and do a series of 5-year missions or longer, whatever, do all the space exploration, and then they were going to come back for a refit because technology would have moved on while they were away in deep space, get upgraded, and go out and do it again. And the hull was going to, have enough resilience in it to bear that refit. And it's an excellent idea, and certainly in terms of building in your ability to accommodate technological developments, it's excellent, but there is one small problem with this idea, and that is you have no clue what future technology is going to be like. Maybe there's some ideas being floated around. So bear in mind the Constitution class was built in the 2240s, and the refit takes place 30 years later in the 2270s. So that would be like predicting today based off the technology of the 90s. I mean, you might be right. Some people were right. A lot of people were wrong. So, there's a bit of a margin for error whenever you do that, and unfortunately the Constitution Refit falls into some of these margins with some of its design. So I'll just go through the changes. Mostly we have structural changes. You have new warp pylons that are sort of flared. It's just an aesthetic change. It doesn't really account for much, maybe a little bit better warp dynamics, but not much to say there. You have a larger saucer, new saucer, and it's bigger, so that kind of changes up the proportions a little bit. You have a new design to the armament layout. The armament hasn't necessarily changed, it's still phasers and photon torpedoes, but the layout has changed. Depending on what on-screen evidence you want to go with, the original Constitution had effectively 3 what we'll call universal turrets. One of the top side of the saucer, one of the ventral side of the saucer, and one in the tail. And these would include phasers and photon torpedo launchers. Equally, do you just say they couldn't make a very detailed model because that thing was made out of wood, and so they couldn't put on specific weapon details, so they just fired the weapons from centers of mass? You can say that, and I don't mind people who go back and put motion picture era style turrets onto original series era hulls. I think that's fine for because it's a thing that we can visually see and understand, and that's probably why they did that. Why that was originally the case in the original series was they just couldn't bring out that much detail in the model, and that's why it's then included. in the motion picture model, because now they can put that much detail on. And I will get on to the weapons because those are significant to the refit. The other change is also a new internals. Not much to say here. The corridors are much, much tighter, and space is being used much, much more efficiently, though I don't know psychologically how good it would be for long-range deep space exploration as the more open, colourful corridors of the 2260s Enterprise was. That's perhaps a bit debatable. There's a similar size or a slightly bigger crew by about 20 people, depends on what source you look at. But for the most part, a slightly bigger crew, more compact space. So, that's interesting. But not really kind of essential to what we're talking about. The key to talking about the Constitution refit and the fundamental source of everything great about it and everything bad about it are in the new core. That is the core of the issue. So, the main upgrade is the warp core. This is like huge, it's a massive change. We go from a horizontal Archer-style engine, which we see in the original Enterprise. It's basically that thing behind the big screen in engineering. That's the Archer-style engine. It's obviously a bigger one, but it basically, it's built into the structure of the ship. You're certainly not pulling it out and putting in a new one. That, the ship is built effectively around that engine piece. And interestingly enough, one of the little bits of continuity that Discovery does actually keep to is that the Discovery had a horizontal warp engine. I appreciated the detail, even if I didn't appreciate other things. But we go from that to the vertical warp core, like we'll then go on to see in Next Generation, various other things, which has numerous benefits. It's vastly more powerful. It's inconceivably more powerful. This is a revolutionary technology. It's a colossal understate. I cannot overstate how much of a change this was in the amount of power that became available to a Starship and the amount of control and variability they were able to achieve in power generation, and the ability for this technology to evolve as it would into the 24th century. Now, there are several key pros, other than just generally more power, that we can actually attribute to this new core. For the first, we have more power available to the impulse engines. So, partially because of the size of the core, and I'll get on to that issue, but it ties into the impulse engines. That that big crystal you see at the top of at the back of the saucer, is called an impulse crystal, and basically what that does is translate plasma from the warp core into the impulse system. There's then a little fusion reactor for the impulse system itself, and that is what pushes the ship forward at sublight. It's very, very good. It's very, very powerful. It gives the ship a lot more speed and agility at sublight speeds. It also means that you're not hauling around two different reactor systems with two different kinds of fuel and two different sets of parts and maintenance crews and all that. The impulse reactors are much more peripheral on this design as they were compared to the original Constitution, where they are, a whole different system unto themselves. So it's a great way to unify and condense the ship's power plant. The other thing that the new warp core is very handy for is that it's able to power the phasers. Now, this does mean that phasers cannot be used at warp, but you shouldn't be doing that anyway. That's a whole debatable thing. There's evidence in TOS, there's evidence in, in this particular instance, phasers cannot be used in warp, but that's fine. You have photon torpedoes, and it gives you much more power to those phasers when it counts at sublight speeds. Those are some very, very powerful phasers now. This does have some small problems. You're obviously then reliant on the warp reactor, and it means the phasers themselves have a limited reserve. Again, unlike before where they were a more separated, isolated system. They still were reliant on the ship's power systems, but you could go for much longer without the warp reactor running and still be able to fire the phasers on the original Constitution. But you didn't get as much power, so I'll leave it at that. Those are all the benefits of this new warp core, and of course more warp speed. But there are several problems. In fact, there are 4. And it's all tied to the fact that this is now a vertical warp core and not a horizontal warp core. You see, it doesn't look like the designers of the original Constitution factored this in when they were designing the Constitution, because if they did, the ship would look very different. So, your first problem with this new warp core is integration. You cannot put this warp core where the old one was. It's too tall. I mean, you could put a core in there, but it would be pathetic. It wouldn't even be worth having. Because this core has to be as tall as it is for it to work, they needed to bring it forward to the tallest point in the ship, with the most draft available, and that was in the neck. So, the core has now been brought forward into the neck. Problem 2. The ship's warp core used to be behind a nice thick screen, and that would protect the crew and the engineering personnel from the majority of the radiation. Not only that, but the core was at the very back of the ship, right next to where the nacelle pylons, right between the nacelle pylons. It was very, very, very far away from most of the activity on the ship. Because this core has been brought forward, and it's no longer behind a radiation screen, this now means 2 problems. 1, everyone in engineering now has to wear protective gear if they're going to be in there for any protracted length of time. Otherwise, that big glowy column of radiation is not going to do good things to you. But also, even if you're not working in engineering, you're now closer to this big glowy column of radiation because it's been brought forward right next to the habitation area. The saucer section is now right next door to where the warp reactor was, as opposed to the original Constitution, where the two are about as far apart as they can possibly be. So, that's another problem with this new warp core. And certainly, it means that it's a much greater radiation hazard. Problem 3. This new warp core takes up a lot more space in the neck and the engineering hull because of its height. It's not just that it runs through the neck and up towards the saucer section, which is, where everyone lives. It's also that it's still taking up just as much, if not more space in the engineering section, because you have this now very long plasma transfer conduit that runs all the way back to the nacelle pylons, and it's a completely open space, you can see it. But that means that space is all taken up with core and plasma transfer conduit. To say nothing of the vulnerabilities that also creates. I mean, if you really wanted to disable the Enterprise's warp engines, just shoot her amidships. And we'll get on to the various ways you can kill a Constitution refit. And now we get to problem 4, and this is perhaps the most grievous of problems and the most heinous of design sins. So, the phasers were relocated across the surface of the ship into distinct batteries, and so were the photon torpedoes. I've seen some diagrams that show rear photon torpedo launchers, but if you look on the model, there are none. There are 2 forward photon torpedo tubes. And where are those torpedo tubes placed? On the neck. That very, very noticeable torpedo pod on the neck. What else is in the neck? The warp core. So now you have photon torpedoes and the warp core basically sharing the same space. There's basically nothing between them apart from a few thin walls. Genuinely, if you look at the schematic, the warp core does pretty much run through the photon torpedo bay. I'm astounded they even managed to fit both of the things in. I don't think I need to explain to you why it's bad, but for those of you who perhaps are like Deanna Troi, photon torpedo go boom. Warp core also go boom. Put photon torpedo and warp core together and big boom going to happen. So, there you go. I mean, I don't think I need to explain that any further than big boom. And all it takes is one clean hit to the torpedo bay. and the entire ship is going up. The entire thing. And the reason I would say that this is so groups, now you might say, well, yeah, but anyone who's going to be hit in their torpedo launcher is going to explode, or anyone hit in their warp core is going to explode. And this is not necessarily the case. If you look at the Miranda, which is basically the same era as the Constitution refit, its torpedoes are kept very, very separate to the ship's power plant in a separate pod. So that even if they do blow up that pod, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a warp core breach. You have enough safety protocols and enough distance between the two sections that you can prevent that from happening. The Excelsior has torpedo launchers, but they're all buried in the ship's hull. And the warp core is buried even further in the ship's hull. It would be very, very difficult to hit any of them. Unlike the Constitution refit, which only requires one, I won't even say lucky shot, because it's such an easy target from the side angles. From any side angle. There's even, if you increase the contrast on the Enterprise model, you can even see a very nice blue line that runs the height of the neck. And that is specifically marking, it's a subtle little thing, but it really comes out when you increase the contrast. And that's marking where the warp core is. So just shoot the blue line. So like I say, other ships of this era don't have these problems. And this fundamentally comes back to the fact that they were built for the technology of that era, and not the technology that people 30 years ago thought it was going to be, which is what the Constitution refit is. It's what people 30 years ago thought the 2270s were going to look like. You know, oddly enough, they weren't quite right. And so, really what this goes to show is that upgrade programs like this, that are so drastic, and that are so far-flung in the future, you're trying to look so far into the future, you're not looking 10 years into the future, you're looking 30 years into the future, are almost certainly going to result in diminishing returns. Because you just cannot easily predict the direction of future technology. And so, this is why I think the Constitution refit ruined a perfectly good Starship. Thank you guys for watching. I will thank my members. In particular, I will thank my Navarks, David Reeves and Tully DT. My commanders, Martin McConville, Jeff Hallam, Captain's Quarters, Miami Jules, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Bird Monster, Jeffrey Ballard, Straight Talk Crypto, and Mark Philippe, and my Centurions, Nathaniel Mead, Arian Fulton, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Adam Bowman, John Nicole, and Marcus Hall. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and thank you guys all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Make sure to leave your comments, and if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, because that does show the algorithm that you are interested in this content. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in the next video.